Our guest today is Alec Ross, one of America's leading experts on innovation. The focus of our discussion is based on his book entitled Industries of the Future, which explores the technological developments and economic trends that will affect countries, societies, and even you in the coming years. Alec is currently a distinguished visiting fellow at Johns Hopkins University. Previously, he was a convener of technology policy for Barack Obama's 2008 presidential campaign, and then served as Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's first ever senior advisor for innovation. Alec, you've traveled the world. You've been to over 41 countries during your stint at the State Department, and I'm sure many more. And you've seen many new technologies, some that are being used, some in experimental stage. So could we just begin by asking you to talk a little bit about what you see as the industries of the future?
Overwhelmingly, the writing being done from the perspective of Silicon Valley or about the technology and the science doesn't really scrutinize the ethical issues and the humanistic issues that relate to the scientific and technological developments. So one of the things that I've really tried to do in writing the industries of the future is bring that content to the fore, so that as technology, as science advance, they're scrutinized, using our really human values. As to what are the industries of the future, I'll just give a very, very brief gloss over what certain of them are. Number one, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and robotics. I think that the robots of the cartoons and movies from the 1970s are going to be the reality of the 2020s. I also look at the rise of big data. Land was the raw material of the agricultural age. Iron was the raw material of the industrial age. Data is the raw material of the information age. So examine big data in its full dimensions and try to look at how it interrelates to existing industries like agriculture, like foreign language learning, and other such things. Cybersecurity. We live today in a world of 16 billion internet-connected devices. That is the sum of our computers with internet connections, our mobile phones, our iPads, and the sensors that we have in the supply chain. 4 years from now, which is not that long from now, that number will have grown from 16 billion to 40 billion. So we are creating Pacific Ocean's worth of data, Pacific Ocean's worth of information. But as we go from a world that with 16 billion internet connections to 40 billion internet connections and move more of our lives, like our electronic medical records, to the cloud, the security risks go with that. I think that the weaponization of code is the most significant development in conflict since the weaponization of fissile material. The difference being that creating a nuclear weapon requires access to the scarcest of scarce scientific talent in transuranium elements, whereas the creation of malware has a much lower barrier to entry. I then examine what the attributes are for states and societies to compete and succeed in the industries of the future, and then conclude the book with a focus on what I call the most important job you'll ever have, which reflects my bias of being a parent.
It seems to me that there are some very serious ethical and moral issues that we should be thinking about in these new industries of the future. For example, what if a robot is hacked by some nefarious force?
Well, I think in general, I think that if somebody hacks a robot, then that is a criminal act. And I think that in the same way in which, machines can be used with malevolent intent, a robot is one more kind of, just another kind of machine that can be used for good or for ill. I think that the far likelier downsides in this case of robotics from the standpoint of our society is less a worry about some sort of recreation of Terminator, and is much more, I think the bigger problem goes to the meat and potatoes of labor displacement. So I think that the real challenge that comes with robotics goes to the next wave of automation of labor. So the last wave of automation that took place largely replaced the work of men with strong shoulders. The work was manual and routine, and it displaced the labor taking place in ports, factories, mills, and mines. Okay? With the combination of artificial intelligence with robotics, what this means is that the kind of labor that can be displaced is not merely manual and routine, but it can also be cognitive and non-routine. And so what this means is that the nature of the labor displacement is going to grow into new and different forms of labor. And that honestly worries me a lot more than people hacking robots.
But new jobs will be created
Yes?
that we don't really know about right now. But should the federal government in some way be involved in creating the safety net for those who will be losing their jobs?
So that's a really important question. You know, I think that, first of all, that there ought to already be a safety net. I think that most people would say that there is a safety net. The question is looked at over a much longer horizon. If we believe that the labor economics will create a net permanent loss of jobs, the question then becomes, all right, well, what interventions do we make in the safety net? I mean, if we look at it, sort of just take a cold-blooded view of things right now, we have 4.9% unemployment in the United States. Now, the permanently displaced, those who are no longer following, let's say it doubles that number. That is still really good, and it's shockingly good relative to where we were in 2008, 2009. But I do think it's reasonable to sort of model out, all right, if we are going to automate more kinds of labor, and if that 4.9% becomes 8.9%, 11.9%, then I do think we need to examine the safety net. There's a lot of chatter in Silicon Valley right now about a universal basic income. I think that that is unlikely at this point for a variety of different reasons, not the least of which is that we can't afford a new entitlement program while we're still running up the kinds of deficits that we have. But one thing that we can do in advance of any work examining our safety net is looking at the outputs of our education system and making sure the outputs of our education system map to the areas where we know job growth will be. You made the point that there will be job growth. So what we need to make sure is that in the education programs that serve many of the most vulnerable Americans, like vocational education, community college, these sorts of things, what I would do in advance of thinking about things like a UBI, a universal basic income, or other safety net programs, I would examine the education programs which serve the neediest Americans and make sure that their outputs really map to where the job growth will be.
Okay, moving on, we talked earlier about privacy being so important, and it brings up so many ethical issues in terms of, you know, how far does government interfere with our personal and private life? And of course, this leads to big data and what, you know, the servers and what Google and other Facebook is using with the data accumulated by our being on the internet. Could you speak to that for a little bit?
Sure. So I think that the impact of big data on privacy is extremely consequential. But let's break this into sort of its constituent parts. So let's make a distinction between surveillance and sousveillance. Okay? Surveillance, people watching you from on high, the NSA say. Sousveillance, you know, those of us with video-enabled mobile phones watching each other. I am significantly more worried about sousveillance than I am about surveillance. Having spent, you know, countless hours in the White House Situation Room and having been somebody who's on the receiving end of the intelligence reports that, you know, say what various people are doing, I can honestly say that why government surveils is to identify terrorists and other people who are trying to create harm. You know, they are not trying to find out who's sleeping with who or who's cheating on their homework or anything like that. They are legally precluded from doing so. So I'm much less worried about surveillance from our own country than I am about sousveillance, than I am about all of the little digital fingerprints that we leave everywhere. When I was growing up in West Virginia, and I went out the back door into the woods to play with my friends in the morning, I was not sending or receiving any data. I lived a relatively data-free life. I didn't send or receive a single email until after I was out of college. I didn't own a mobile phone until I was 28 years old. By contrast, my children, from nearly the moment they awaken in the morning, they are creating these little digital fingerprints. And so what I worry about is that in a world grown more transparent, because we are all emitting so much data, and because so much data is being captured from what will be 40 billion internet-connected devices, what I worry about is the norms that we have around privacy today evaporating. And I question the ability of this to be effectively regulated. What I think is more likely to happen is that as our lives grow more transparent because of more information being captured, I have a feeling that societal norms will shift. Let's think about drug use in presidential candidates. When Bill Clinton ran for president in 1992, it was a very consequential question of whether he inhaled or not. Did he inhale on a marijuana joint? Fast forward 16 years, Barack Obama was like, oh, I inhaled. I inhaled a lot, and I liked it. And oh, by the way, I did coke, too. Non-issue in the campaign. So what shifted from 1992 to 2008? Norms shifted. So what I imagine is that in a world with constantly eroding privacy, we'll all have a scandal. Human fallibility will be in near constant view, and norms will shift. Should we just accept this? No. But I do think it's near inevitable.
During the Cold War, we had a policy of mutually assured destruction. And it was effective. Nobody dropped an A-bomb on anybody else for quite a long time. In the area of cybersecurity, how would you advise Hillary or anyone else in the White House? What should the policy be? What should the degree of use of cyber warfare be before the United States should retaliate in kind or perhaps better than in kind?
Yep. What's interesting is when you describe the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, what you're describing, in essence, is the framework that existed beginning in the late 1950s, 1960s, and we then created a series of treaty structures to govern proliferation. What's interesting about the cyber domain is that it is not as binary. It's not just USA versus USSR, where there can be a bilateral set of negotiations that establishes norms and frameworks. We're in sort of a norm-free zone. We're in a law-free zone. We are in a treaty-free zone. And I think a mistake made by the United States government for the longest time was it assumed that it would benefit from the kind of asymmetry that the United States had in nuclear weapons in, say, the late 1940s, right? We thought that we would be the sole cyber power and that we were inherently hostile to any kind of boundary setting because we were so much stronger than everybody else. But what we learned was that the barriers to entry in cyber conflict are very low. And in fact, even though we might be the strongest in this domain, we in many respects have the most to lose. So to your question, step one, I think, is to not rest on our laurels and accept our asymmetry, but recognize that it is actually worth doing deals multilaterally to bring more states including ourselves, into an understanding that the cyber domain cannot be a Wild West. There cannot be kinetic activity that goes unchecked. So right now, as we sit here, there is kinetic activity between the United States and China. And I think that it is, quite consequential. As to when I would ever advise to use a cyber weapon, I would say where doing so will save lives in a significant number and where the malware can be contained. So I'll give you an example. one time that this was examined was in advance of the attack in Tripoli, the beginning of the NATO actions to remove Gaddafi. And the question essentially was, if we bomb the air defenses, it'll create a body count of a certain number. Can we cyber attack it? Where basically we turn off the air defenses without anything blowing up and without anybody dying. Now, a determination was made that it couldn't be done within the time frame projected, but if I could push a button and keep buildings from blowing up and people from being killed, I would do it. But here's the other aspect of this that I think needs to be understood. Unlike a bullet that after being shot cannot be reshot, or a grenade, after you pull the pin, throw the grenade and it goes off, you can't reconstitute the grenade and use it again. Malware is different. A cyber weapon is different. So it is alleged, I have to say it is alleged that the cyber weapons developed that were in use against the Iranian nuclear facilities, there is evidence that in the code base of that malware, that a subsequent cyber attack emanating from Iran directed against Saudi Aramco, the Saudi, the large oil company, actually had a digital signature that looked a lot like what was alleged to have used against Iran. So theoretically, what this means is Iran, having been a victim of a cyber attack, which allegedly crippled its capabilities in the nuclear domain, having now access to that code base, used it against the Saudis. Again, it's not like a bullet or like a grenade. So for me, what this does is it makes it all the more necessary to create structures that contain the use of these weapons. Because maybe only the world's most sophisticated nation states can develop the weapons, but if they can be repurposed by states or non-state entities with significant lower capabilities, then I think the consequences are quite significant.
I'd like to hear you speak a little bit about another subject that I know you focus on in the book, which is Bitcoin.
Yep.
And this is straying a bit far from my wheelhouse, but I'm curious whether even in the time since you've written the book, the attitude of institutional investors towards Bitcoin has changed in a way that maybe narrows that gap in sort of the potential for regular people to see that. Again, my very basic understanding is that there's been sort of a move to try and replicate some of the parts of Bitcoin that people find attractive,
Right,
while keeping it exclusive in a way that maybe takes away from what I will assume will be part of your answer of what the promise is. Thank you.
yes. So thank you for asking that very good question. First, let me make a distinction between Bitcoin and blockchain. So Bitcoin, for those of you who don't know, was a cryptocurrency, the purpose of which essentially was to be a competitor currency to fiat currencies. It was released by either a person or network of people known as Satoshi Nakamoto, who have never revealed their identities. But the idea essentially was that fiat currency, and the word fiat in Latin means it shall be, basically relies on the full faith and credit of the nation state. And in the fall of 2008, the full faith and credit of the nation state as guarantor of our economic well-being was sufficiently diminished. And so Bitcoin was created. Now, I think that Bitcoin has a number of structural flaws. And truthfully, it functioned less as a currency, less as a store of value and medium of exchange than it did as a speculative asset. So it was much more like a stock you would bet on, with values going way up and way down, than as a legitimate store of value or as a medium of exchange. I still, to this day, I couldn't buy a cup of coffee with any practicality using Bitcoin. But, big but here, there was a genius technological innovation within the creation of Bitcoin called a blockchain, okay? And what the blockchain basically is, it is a distributed cryptographic ledger system. Basically, it is a way of doing highly trusted transactions using crypto, so it's theoretically very secure. And what is interesting is now, even since I sort of hit send on the manuscript, What I see is not so much mainstream as in mainstream defined as middle American walking down Main Street in Kansas. I don't know that I've seen an increased recognition of mainstream consumer America understanding the application of blockchain technology. What I have seen is mainstream financial institutions understanding the potential of blockchain technology within their operations. So the example that I give is Lloyd Blankfein, the CEO of Goldman Sachs. I've had 3 conversations about blockchain with Lloyd Blankfein. And regardless of what any of you think about Goldman Sachs, these guys know how to make money. First time I asked him about it, he goes, "Oh, you know, Bitcoin, isn't that where people do like buy drugs and stuff like that?" Second time, he said, "Oh, you know, some people insist it's worth, you know, our looking at, and I'll let them do that work as long as they do their other work too." Last conversation I had with him, he goes, "Yeah, we're looking at the technology." And then in December, Goldman Sachs filed a patent for something called Settlecoin, which is a cryptocurrency leveraging blockchain technology. Now, Goldman Sachs is not trying to create a competitor currency to the dollar, the yen, the yuan, or the euro. But what it has figured out is it has figured out how, by creating a sort of walled garden where they can do asset settlements, stock sales, electronic transfers of funds, things like this, between, say, China and the United States, without those crazy fees and without so much falling off the back of the truck, that they can save an enormous amount of money. Any of you who have ever been paid or tried to pay somebody transnationally, it is a pain in the neck. I mean, you know, to get paid $10,000, you're paying a $300 fee. What I think is that blockchain technology will take that $300 to transfer $10,000, and it'll take it to 3 cents. Taking the well-being of Goldman Sachs out of it, what I think is most positive is the implications for the developing world, where remittances are so important. You know, the Bangladeshi workers working as construction workers in the United Arab Emirates, the Mexicans working in restaurants and here in New York and sending money back to Mexico. Being able to draw the friction and the fees out of international payments, I think, will significantly benefit the developing world.
Focusing in on cybersecurity, there's a lot of, as you know, fretting in fairly high places about our the vulnerability of our electrical grid system to cyber attacks, and the observation is they would be fairly easy to hack into. Do you agree with that it would be all that simple, and are we doing halfway enough to build up buffers that would prevent such attacks?
So the answer is no. I don't think it's that easy. What I do believe is that there are certain states that have the capability, who we know have gotten inside various networks, but what they lack are the incentives to do anything. So let's use China as a straw man, okay? China, let's assume that they have significant cyber capabilities and that they could get into our grids. Right now, the Chinese government does not have any incentive to turn the lights out. If the lights get turned out in New York and the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ plummet 3-4%, you want to know who's a loser? China, because they are equity holders. They are stakeholders in our interconnected economy. The biggest threat are the Russians. And the reason why the Russians are the biggest threat is because in a Ukraine post-sanctions world, the Russians increasingly do not feel like stakeholders in sort of the collective well-being of our markets. And so what I believe is that the Russian government presents far and away the greatest threat to literally or proverbially turning the lights out. And when I say the Russian government, I mean both the units inside the Russian government with the capability, as well as the Nashi and other sort of state-affiliated national, sort of hyper-nationalist hacker organizations aligned with Putin. And this is where, you know, the brinksmanship really, this is where it's sort of like a middle school playground where you're sort of testing each other. And what I believe is that the Russians haven't really tested us here. And I think part of why they haven't really tested us here is I think that they do believe that at least this administration would respond and respond fairly ferociously. And I think they believe that we would respond fairly ferociously because we've told them we would respond fairly ferociously. And I do think that, what's interesting is I do believe that Obama has grown increasingly bellicose in the cyber domain. He's a different president on this today than when I came into government in 2009. So even, I believe, turning the lights out on the internet in North Korea, I believe came from, it was coordinated between the United States and the Chinese government as a way of essentially sending a signal, sending a message to the North Koreans. Don't do that again, or we'll cut off your access to porn, which is what I really believe it is. So, I do think that the biggest threat here comes from the Russians and that they have not yet tested. They have not yet tested it. But I don't think it would be easy to do this. I think if it were easy, it would have been done because there are enough non-state actors out there who want nothing but mayhem for us that they would have done it.
Thank you very much.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.